Welcome to Dark Loops Productions, Systems Gone Wild. I'm Dr. Scott Jordan, aka Zombie Scotty, cognitive psychologist, philosopher at Illinois State University. And it's my absolute pleasure to once again work with Dr. Gurpyari Bhatnagar and her group of students. Dr. Bhatnagar, please introduce yourselves, tell everyone a little something about why we're here, and then please introduce your students.
All right. Thank you, Professor Scott. I'm Gurpyari Bhatnagar, Associate Professor of English Literature at Sharda University, India. So thank you, Professor Jordan, for graciously consenting to do this, to engage in this discussion. Must acknowledge that the last discussion that we've had on your wild anticipation paper was very helpful for me and my students. And I'm hopeful for another equally insightful discussion today.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah. So could you introduce your students?
Yeah, Chirag, could we have your introduction?
Yes, hello. Hi, Jordan.
Hello.
Mr. Jordan. Hi, ma'am. So I'm Chirag, and I'm currently pursuing my master's in English from Sharda University, and I'm using Professor Jordan's theories in my paper. And last time we covered one paper of yours, and this time we'll be covering cycle of holism, and really looking forward to it.
Oh, well, it's very good to see you again. Thanks for coming. I appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fatima, if you may go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Jordan. Hello.
Hello.
So my name is Fatima. My name is Fatima. I'm a student in Sharda University. I'm doing master's in English, and I'm very glad to be here with you today.
We're glad to speak with you again. Absolutely.
Yeah, Ishika.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Ishika, and I'm also pursuing masters in English, and I'll also be using Dr. Jordan's theories in my thesis. And today, as we'll be discussing the paper written by you, like Cycle of Holism. So pretty excited about that.
Well, I'm excited as well, and so great to see all of you again. And I'm absolutely thrilled to see wild systems theory be utilized in literature critique. All right, that was kind of the goal, is to create a framework, an ontology that overcomes assumed barriers between the arts and the sciences. And so I'm delighted to see that it feels that way to all of you, and that you might be able to do something with it. So today we're here to talk about the paper Consciousness, Embodiment, and the Cycle of Holism. And what I'm going to do is just give a brief description of why I wrote the paper. I'm not going to talk a lot about the details. I'll talk about the goal of the paper, what I try to accomplish, and then I'll assume students, everyone has comments or whatever, and we'll just take the details from there. So this paper is actually me bringing together two threads of my scholarship. The first is as an experimental psychologist. So as a scientist of perception, I try to study why people's perceptions are as they are. Excuse me. And in that field, there are two dominant frameworks. One is the computer metaphor. And the idea is that the brain is basically just information, or your mind is just information. And since it's just information, like in a computer program, it can be taken out of your brain and put into some other medium. And this is where we get the idea of strong AI, or strong artificial intelligence. And the assumption is that someday we'll be able to crunch the causal relations in your brain into a different medium, and your experienced you will be there. All right. And so that's the information processing perspective. And it's been pretty dominant for at least 50 years, if not more. 20 miles, probably 30 years ago, researchers started challenging this idea that the mind is disembodied. They started challenging the idea that the mind exists independently of the physical substrate that it's in. And experimental psychologists started doing research to show that our thoughts and our perceptions are actually constrained by our body. In other words, we weren't able to subtract having a body from the way that our mind worked. And this is a strong critique of strong AI. So people would do experiments in which, for example, they'd have people put pens in their mouths. I don't know if that makes you smile or it makes you frown, but in cases where it made you smile, they found that people were more or quicker at identifying happy words. And if they did some other facial structure like a frown, they found that people were faster at identifying sad words. So all this research was going on to show that aspects of your body are actually showing up in the way you think and the way you perceive. And this was called embodied cognition. And so that was a, I guess to some extent it is a big deal, but it was really being pushed hard in the early 2000s, 2010s. So I was kind of part of that vibe. And you can see the arguments that I made in the paper, pro, con, that view. At the same time that was going on, I was also doing wild systems as a philosophy of reality, or as an ontology. And for me, what the embodied cognition camp failed to explain is, why does a body matter? And what they also refused to explain, which is more fundamental for me, is what is a body? In other words, they took it as a given that my arms, my legs, my teeth, my eyes, that's what a body is. But that's not a fundamental, foundational scientific description of what a body is. So that means if they're not going to take the time to describe what a body is scientifically, then we're left with the body being a physical thing as scientists have been describing it for centuries. So what I found is that even though I agreed that the phenomenon we call perception and cognition were being constrained by the dynamics of what we call bodies, I still don't think that solved anything to do with why consciousness exists and why I argue consciousness exists, or what I've called embodied context necessarily exists. So what I saw was people in the field of psychology arguing with people that had done work 30, 40 years ago. And then what you do, if you follow the way scholarship works, people are arguing with people from 30, 40 years ago. And this just goes on and on and on, and that's fine. But what you find with the embodied camp is that they were starting to move into a direction that we had left at the turn of the 20th century. So in other words, at the turn of the 20th century, the German idealists were already arguing in ways that are consistent with wild systems theory and the notion of embodied context. The person I talk about in the paper the most is Baruch de Spinoza, who challenged Descartes' division of reality into spiritual and physical components. And Spinoza basically made the argument, if we believe in God and we believe that God is infinite, that means that we are nested within God. That means that we naturally have properties of godness, which would be what we call physical and what we call mental or psychological. So since we were believed to be nested within everything, Spinoza's theory is called double aspect theory. It means there's one reality, and in Spinoza's time, that reality was God, and we are manifestations of God. We are, if you like to use my language, embodiments of God, and that's why Spinoza used the word finitudes. He used that word finitudes to argue that we are little finite bits in the infinite reality of God, and because we are such, we have all the properties of God, both physical and psychological or mental. So that's so totally consistent with the notion of embodied context, right? That I said, how the heck did we get from Spinoza to embodied cognition? And what you see is people picking up Spinoza's ideas and trying to keep us holistically grounded in reality. using the parlance of their day. And so the German idealists said it their way. We don't have to talk about that now. But at the turn of the 20th century, Western science did not like that holist philosophy of the Germans. And so they started making arguments as to why there are things in reality that are completely independent of other things. And we call that external relations. So reality once again begins to be parsed into things that are independent. And you see that just running through Western philosophy up to the 60s, 70s, 80s, to the point where you get to strong AI, and the thing we call mind is now completely independent of the thing we call physical. And then we suddenly move into embodied cognition, which is once again trying to develop a relation between what we call mind and body. And there are other people that have tried that. But what's not going on is that people aren't paying attention to what was said 200 years ago, and they're not paying attention to the fact that we're going through these cycles. Reality is from a holism, in which we are embodiments of everything, to a sort of what you can call reductionism or nominalism, where the emphasis isn't on being an aspect of everything, but rather the emphasis is on things themselves. Things that have properties. And instead of focusing on how they're an embodiment of their context, we focus on them, what their properties are. And then you beg the question, well, how do they get connected to other things? And of course, that's chemistry and physics, at least classical, right? So, so what I wanted to point out in this paper is, rock on, embodied cognition, I'm there. But please note that you are caught up in a historical cycle, at least in the West, of oscillating from holism to nominalism, and noticing that cycle, which plays out at a larger time scale than the average scholar's life, dare I say, broadens the context of your thinking, and it lets you feel yourself be a part of a tradition as opposed to an element isolated, discussing isolated elements. So I wanted to make the case that if embodied cognition wants to stick around, I made the strong claim that it's going to have to find a way to explain why consciousness is necessary. Now, that's a philosophical claim on my part. I claimed at the end that if the embodied cognition movement can find a way to scientifically embed what we are in everything and make our aboutness necessary, it'll stick around. And of course, that's why Wild Systems was built. So yeah, there's a bit of self-promotion going on there. But the point is to describe the historical context in which I believe I got to that point. And that was the goal of the paper. What is embodied cognition? And then what's the cycle of scholarship that it's caught up in? So that's what I tried to do. Any comments or questions or?
All right. So, just one quick question first. When you talk about mind, for instance, does mind only relate to ordinary awareness, or in terms of cognition is what we are trying to explore? Because when we're going to talk about narratives that are set in the literary texts, right? So there, as I said earlier also, we're going to talk about experiences which are going to be tripartite,
Mm-hmm.
Where and here we are relating mind to both kinds of experiences, which
Yes.
are relating to transcendence, as well as relating to information, relating to cognition, right? So at times it becomes difficult for us to align with this very neat division, between mind and body.
Mm-hmm.
So how's it that where we take this as only as in terms of ordinary experiences and not really talk about transcendent in that sense, or how is it that we're going to figure out this very neat division that we could in a way explore in terms of the subjective experiences that we have in our narratives. So that in a way is becoming a little challenging for us when we go to very specific narratives in terms of embodied experiences.
Well, I very much appreciate you bringing that framework back to this conversation. We talked about that a lot in previous conversations. I think I would also dare to make the claim that there are cultural differences here in how mind is discussed. And in Western science, I'm just going to speak in generalities, but mind is, I'm going to say, it's used as a placeholder for scientists, but it's not a very scientifically useful term. Right. But the reason, at least in my field, in my time in the field, the reason people are using the word mind and say, I'm doing the science of mind, I'm doing the science of cognition, what they're trying to really say is I'm not doing biology, I'm not doing physics, and I'm not doing chemistry. I'm doing this other thing. How do people think? How do people perceive? And they don't want that. And at least in the United States, we went through a long struggle for that not to reduce to physics, for that science not to reduce to chemistry and biology. So when people use the mind, the concept, I'm going to argue it doesn't have a very robust positive definition. It's a dialectic in the sense that it gets its meaning from what it's opposite to. And what it's opposite to is the sciences involved with things like the body, chemistry, physics. So the mind is kind of the concept mind, I think we talked about this last time, historically in the West is a byproduct of moving away from Christianity for reference to truth. And when we moved from Christianity for reference of truth, we didn't get rid of spirit. What we did was keep the dichotomy between body and soul, but instead of it being body and soul, John Locke felt that we could do science on that stuff called soul, the perceptions and the thoughts, so they called it mind. So it still contains the dualism we began with. It doesn't overcome it. It believes it does because it believes it can naturalize the mind. So all that said, you can see that that's clearly not as sophisticated as the tripart description of phenomenology that you mentioned. At the same time, what I'm describing is the cultural context within which our definition of mind emerges as scientists. And, on the one hand, when I say these things, I feel like, Scott, you're just throwing words around. These things may not really matter that much, and then you feel guilty as a philosopher. But then you go online and you see that a prominent AI scientist was asked, what will AI be able to do? Is there anything that AI will not be able to do better than humans? And the AI person couldn't ask the question, and the answer made people scared. But what they don't understand is that they're throwing these words around as if that's the only way to talk about the phenomenon, right? In other words, what will AI do? What will AI not be able to do better than humans? First of all, what does better mean, right? What does smarter mean? And it completely depends on accepting the idea of mind as information, right? The fact that this AI expert had entertained understanding of mind was so thoroughly entrenched and constrained by the notion of information, that's diagnostic of that's all I need to understand why I would create wild systems theory, because there are other ways of thinking about it. For example, If you take AI outputs and you feed them back into the AI generator will crash. The reason AI works is it's going out on the internet, collecting all that human noise, all that human variability, and making equations based on that variability. When it starts producing its own stuff and feeding it back into itself, the noise isn't there like it was when it was dealing with us. So, yeah, sussing out what mind means is I think just philosophically important and politically important as well. So what I try to do there is explain why we use the word mind the way we do and how it can definitely feel unsatisfying in cultures that have dealt with the richness of phenomenology more robustly and actually experience themselves and the phenomena we call mind that way, right? I do think that wild systems theory is created to afford a coherence between what you're talking about, tripart, and what I would call embodiment of context. The thing about embodiment of context is the subtle Trojan horse that's been created is that once I'm using the concept embodiment of context, now when I'm talking about reality, I don't need words physical, mental, mind, right? And then when you use the concept of tripart consciousness or it fits, for me, it seems to fit seamlessly into the notion of multi-scale embodied context.
Right.
So wild systems theory was constructed precisely to be a bridge from our dualism to, I would argue, an ontology, a model of reality that's much more consistent with how 80% of the world's population experiences themselves, right? So we can talk about that more, about how I think that would work, but
Right.
yeah, what I'm trying to do is get to the point where I don't use the word mind. I know
Yeah.
what it means at dinner parties. And I know it's very hard to publish as a scholar on the phenomenon like literature if you're not going to use concepts like mind and cognition and feeling and all those things, which are all byproducts of the way we organized reality and how we talk about it. But and I know that talking about it as embodied context doesn't work at conferences yet, right? I totally get that. And for me, that's just the fun and the joy of staying in it and having wonderful conversations like this and seeing, what we can do with it.
No, rather, we have, come to your theory, your theoretical framework. Yes, because we don't really need to demystify the transcendental experiences, that we come across in the narratives. And that's the
Yes.
reason, we've come to your theory. Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Sebald in the Rings of
yeah,
Saturn
right.
actually uses fairly traditional language, but the skill is to combine those words in a way that affords a transpersonal experience. So it's there, right? The issue is, how do you get there? And if you're going to be a scholar, how do you use words that feel like you're sketching out a rational description of something transcendental, right? That's the dialectic, is that you're trying to explain something that kind of defies words, using words. And we often we feel the tension, but we also often don't recognize the limits of language, right? Unless we go to poetry, or unless we go to something like Sebald or good literature, and then the words are being organized to actually put us in a multi-scale state of contradiction. And it's in that tension where the transcendental feeling and the feeling of embeddedness can happen, but it rarely happens in expository text. Yeah.
So I think we'll start with, asking you questions around your paper first,
Mhm.
and then we'll see, how's it that we can go ahead with the discussion, so that
Mhm.
we understand the paper, very thoroughly.
Yeah.
So, so Fatima, if we may begin with you, if you have, very specific questions.
Okay, so Dr. Jordan, since you brought about the concept of
Fatima, I think you'll have to be louder, or you need to not really able to
Can you
get you.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, yes, we can. Yes.
So I said, since Dr. Jordan mentioned the word rational, I wanna speak about the importance of, for us as literature students or scholars, the importance of the irrational as well.
Mhm.
We need to situate the irrational within this framework. For example, can we say that, since you brought about Spinoza, can we say that WSC is a framework that helps us conceive of the finite or the finite as a continuum towards the infinite?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Wow.
the irrational, as have been stated by Jung, is the realm of imagination, the realm
Mhm.
of symbolism. And what's most important for us in literature is symbolism. So, as I said, Jung came up with this concept of the collective unconscious.
Mhm.
So we need to have a comprehensive idea about the unconscious. Is it the stage that precedes the embodiment of the context?
Mm.
That is, we are not oscillating between consciousness and unconsciousness. It's actually consciousness is what constrains unconsciousness based
Yeah.
on the wild systems theory.
So, first of all, that's a fantastic question. Thanks for sussing through those ideas to bring that question to bear. Because those are things that wild systems theory hasn't directly addressed. At the same time, those are things that at some point it will, right? And it's the phenomenon that we're referring to as the irrational. So this may sound bizarre where I'm going to go, but I do think the 21st century is going to be the century of the trickster. The trickster God in worldviews is an embodiment of chaos. And for us, chaos sounds bad, right? From a Spinozan perspective, right, I would say that reality is ultimately chaos, disorder. And what WST does is to make the case that any system that's going to be ordered, i.e., be a system, is going to have to capture energy in some way to keep the system in a state of order. So, for example, you mentioned you believe that consciousness is a constraint on the irrational or the unconscious, and you're absolutely right. Just look what happens when you're sleeping, right? When you're sleeping and you're not consciously constraining what's going on with you, you have things called dreams that just go everywhere. And of course, this was the empirical fodder for Jung and the psychodynamic theorists, right? And it was actually their insight into what they want to call the irrational that we then constrain throughout waking life. The reason, I mean, what I like about this is I can have all the dreams, I can have all the dreams I want, and basically The thing is, if I'm going to be in a waking life and find my keys and walk out the door and get to the car and drive down the street, all of that chaos never goes away. It just gets constrained, right? And you all know this because once you've been up for 2 days studying, you can't constrain your experiences anymore. You start to hallucinate. You start to have delusions. You start to say things you would never say if you were consciously able to constrain what you're saying. So the point is that irrational being never goes away. It's always there. And the thing we call consciousness basically surfs on it. And that is why we've been able to sustain ourselves, because we've been able to generate constraints on the disorder, on chaos. We've been able to generate constraints on our own brains. And as we generate these constraints, it takes energy. That's one thing that WST is very specific about. And that energy can be depleted. Things can go wrong with our ability to constrain, and we can end up with things that people call mental disorders, right? So situating the irrational in this framework, first of all, the stuff that we're calling irrational is still embodied. There's nothing about you that's not embodied. And you'll find, I may seem like I'm going everywhere, but I'm getting data indicate that people that are, when you get sea legs, when you're on a ship and it's in the water and you're going all around, and then you get on land and you find it difficult to walk, well, what's happening is you've embodied the chaos of the sea into the way your brain and your muscles are coordinated. Now, how the heck can you embody chaos? Wait a minute, how can you generate something that's unpredictable, right? And what that reveals is that what's going on a boat isn't just existing at one time scale of activity between a wave and your brain. There are multiple scales of wave activity that are nested with each other, and your brain is perfectly capable, and your legs are perfectly capable of generating that multi-scale noise in how your legs work and how your body's balancing works. So when you get out off the boat, you can see the irrationality in your body in terms of the phenomenon we call sea legs. So for me, that's data that the irrationality, the chaos never goes away. And what we do is generate order that rides that chaos, right? And that rides on top of that chaos. And for me, the 21st century is the century in which we're going to come to understand that reality is a trickster. And what we do is manage the trickster. And the trickster is never going away, right? The trickster isn't just one agent in the system, one part of the system. It's what the system is. And what we are systems that harness energy in order to ride the wave of that chaos. And so a good writer is harnessing the chaos in you by using words that manipulate your irrationality in ways that put you in states that you wouldn't be able to get into usually by yourself. And because you're reading it, it feels like someone else is doing it to you, which is why we read, right? When we're reading a novel, it's like watching a movie, right? The movie's generating all this. It's generating order within us as it rides the wave of chaos. And this is what good directors take advantage of, right? So different directors have different styles because they manage chaos in different ways. And imagination is tapping into the chaos, right? Letting your consciousness recede into the background in ways that the chaos can come forward or the irrational can come forward. So I hope that was a great question. I hope my answer made any sense. That's actually the direction I'm going these days. As you guys know, I do a bunch of Comic-Cons, and one of the panels I'm doing now is rise of the tricksters, because if you look at contemporary fiction, at least in the West, you know, we see Loki, we see all of these tricksters becoming prominent in pop culture. And in our world, in the Western world, chaos is to be abated. It's a problem. But medical industry now knows that the heart runs on a system of chaos. If things go wrong in your ability to manage that, that's where heart attacks come from. Yeah, I'll stop there. I hope my answer was at least intriguing, and I'm perfectly comfortable continuing that conversation. So the 21st century will be the century of the irrational.
Yeah. So more questions, Chirag and Ishika?
Sorry, I was. Hello, can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes. Yes, Fatima, go ahead.
I just have another question.
Yeah.
Can we say that in that sense, can we say that imagination is anticipation in that sense?
Ooh, okay, this goes back to the last conversation we had. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I lost that video. But usually, again, I don't know. I know how we use the word anticipation in cognitive science here in the United States and Europe. And it's usually treated as a fairly cognitive phenomenon. What I tried to do in that last paper we discussed, wild anticipation, is to argue that if we take a single cell organism, wild systems theory would argue that the membrane of that cell, the protein membrane that allows some molecules in and keeps some molecules out, right? That boundary comes from the work of the cell itself. And the time scale of activity of that single cell moving around in its environment, right? We can watch that and we can pick some variable like position and we can track that over time. That's one time scale that system is existing within. And then if we look at all the chemical work going on within that cell, that's a faster time scale of activity. And that time scale is nested within the cell as a whole, which is nested in other things as a whole. We can even go down from the chemical to the atomic level if you want and talk about electrons and such. But my point is, we tend to think of beings as things that exist in one time scale responding to stimuli, right? So we have a cause and we have an effect. And wild systems theory, it's not just wild systems theory, it's dynamical systems theory, though they may not say it this way. Describe us as systems that are embodiments of multiple timescales. We persist in multiple timescales simultaneously. So I started saying all that, and now I've actually forgot what you asked. Oh, anticipation is imagination anticipation. So what I want to argue is that the cell wall, the cell as a whole, constrains the dynamic possibilities of the chemical work. In other words, that cell wall is emerging from the chemical work and it's recursively constraining what goes on in that chemical work. This, what you'll call mutual constraint, is what I call anticipation. In other words, the cell wall exists at a larger time scale and it is constraining the dynamic possibilities of what it's made of. Imagination is an anticipation. I've never answered this question before, but if we look at, I mean, if you guys sit and imagine what we do know, that what we do is we kind of generate some simulation and then things come to it that we consciously didn't anticipate, right? Oh, yeah, I didn't think of it that way. That comes to us. So how the heck is our own brain providing surprises for us? Right? How can my own brain surprise me? And if we take this idea of the unconscious, or we take this idea of the irrational, those irrational systems are anticipatory as well, right? They're creating boundaries that are being contextualized and constrained by things we may not have conscious access to. And they're actually generating things that end up surprising our conscious mind, which works at a slower time scale than the things being generated in imagination. I hope that made any sense, but we surprise ourselves in imagination. How many of you have ever written a paper and it's like, damn, I wrote that, where'd that come from? Right? What? That's because this thing we call imagination comes from the chaos, comes from the irrational, comes from the unconscious, and it functions at a faster time scale than the thing we call conscious awareness. And it is simultaneously constraining conscious awareness while simultaneously conscious awareness is constraining it. So things that go on in us, like that we would call mental, like thoughts, imagination, function according to the same nested dynamics as things we would call single cell organisms. What wild systems theory does is not call those single cell systems biological. It calls them self-sustaining energy transformers. And then we can use that same way of thinking to describe what thoughts are and what the irrational might be. So I'll stop there and hope that was helpful.
Yeah, so to take this discussion forward here, so for instance, when the poet or the author uses imagination, there are certain events and interactions that are created in his mind, and if we use the narratives, that have been built in your paper, so these events and interactions, that he has, that they have in their mind, have direct, causal impact on the minds of the reader.
Yes.
And if you take reader as the body here, and if you take the author as the mind, because this is where, certain ideas are being formulated.
Yeah.
But then, the body, which is taken as a reader, will not have the direct causal impact on the mind of the author. Because if the reader does not really get to see the author in person.
Yeah.
So
there's no direct connection between the consumer and the producer. Yet they both exist in the same reality.
Right.
The things happen like people read books.
Right.
They tell other people, or they write a critique. And what happens then is 50 years ago, the way you wrote a critique was on a piece of paper and you sent it to a journal or a newspaper and they published it and it got back to the creator through that time scale of work, right? Now that time loop has basically been crunched. I mean, now people are instantly being critiqued on the internet. So it doesn't have the same immediacy of me reading the text and the impact it's having on me. I, however, have no doubt that within 50 years, I will be someone will be reading someone's book and what they're about will be fed directly into, will transform the dynamics of the creator's brain, right? Now, in order to make this make sense, let's just look at contemporary video games, right? In a contemporary video game, people in France and India and the United States can all play together at the same time. Now, they are all simultaneous creators and consumers, right? Because they're simultaneously jointly creating what's happening on the screen. And that is feeding back at a rather large, quick time scale to each of them, which is then going back on the screen. So I do think everything is forever recursively coupled. I do think that if you stand on the coast of California and kick your feet in the water, you are constraining the possibilities of water on the coast of Japan. It doesn't feel like it because it's so far away, because we tend to think of causality as existing between two elements. But if we think that of everything you do transforming the transformational possibilities of everything else all the time, life becomes rather big, and responsibility comes huge. So the time scale of the influence is what we're collapsing. And so I think if I interrupted you, I'm sorry. I was just going at that point.
No, that makes complete sense there. Especially, when we are again, talking in terms of very, very specific, symbolism here,
Yes.
taking the, author as the mind and the reader as the body, for instance, and we're talking about very strict dualism, that could be dissolved, completely if we use WST, for instance,
Yeah.
which helps.
Yeah. And if you think of everything as in terms of energy transformation,
Right. Yeah.
and then the big jump is believing that everything constrains everything.
Everything. Yeah.
And that's not a traditional philosophical notion in the last 100 years. I would argue that's at the heart of holism. And I wasn't raised to think that way, in college. And it's hard to think that way, in the sense that it feels like you got to force yourself to think that way. Yet when you mention things like transcendental experience from a WST perspective, that means you're opening yourself up to be immediately connected to everything.
Mhm.
And you, as a conscious causer, kind of go into the background. And it's that conscious causer that makes us believe in direct causality and things doing this and that, because I got to find my keys, man. I got to get to the car. I got to get to the street. I got to get to so all of that direct feeling like direct causality kind of gets my conscious mind to experience and conceptualize that way, when underneath it is this torrent of chaos that's about everything. And I think artists have a ton of fun tapping into that chaos. The horror genre is all about, good horror is all about tapping into the chaos that underlies everything that we're scared of, and try to prevent from coming to be. So yeah, those and then I'll just say this and stop. The practical value of wild systems theory is transforming how you experience things, from you being the thing that caused this and someone else being the thing that caused that, to recognize that everything this system does constrains everything any other system can do. And that means that everything I do matters. And then, so how do I do things? How do I manage my mattering in ways that can lead to self-respect, or in some cultures can lead to enlightenment, right? And I don't think it's an accident that in worldviews like Buddhism, the issue is to joyful embrace the sorrow that is life, right? And finding ways to be in sorrow without being in a state of despair. And that for me, in my language, that means we respect ourselves most when we help others respect themselves, because we are connected to each other. We are naturally and necessarily about each other. And quite often in what we do to deal with the anxiety we have, because we're not managing the suffering of others. And look, I'm sitting here today. I'm not down at a soup kitchen, so I'm not trying to pretend I'm this or that. What we do to manage that anxiety is to come up with worldviews, that don't point out my connection to everyone else, right? And binaries, dualisms are very good ways to keep suffering at bay, keep it separate from my life, and keep me from seeing that I'm connected to everything. And that is not a judgy statement. That is not a moral statement. That is a worldview ontological description of what we are and what we're in. When I say these kind of things, people often feel like I'm judging them. All right. I don't care if you're racist. I don't know what that means. The question is, what stays the same in the world for other people because of the way you live your life? You may not even know what those things are. You may just buy a house in a neighborhood and not know what's being done with the profits made by banks, and where they're investing and what they're keeping going. You just do your bit and then blissfully get along in that space. People feel like I'm judging them when they say that. And I think they feel like they're being judged because they're not used to experiencing themselves as connected to everything. And when you see that, when you can't hide from it, and again, I'm making strong philosophical claims now, then there's anxiety, and then what do I do? How do I help the world manage its suffering? And people make choices and move on, right? So